This is going to be lessons learned scaling Kubernetes. I want to start out, I mean, like whenever I do these kinds of talks, hopefully my slides will keep advancing. Oh, I think PowerPoint is like trying to be super clever with the animations or something. I don't know, it's just slow. All right. I don't know, something is happening there. Hopefully this will work better. Whenever I give these sort of talks, I get a little bit uncomfortable. And I think I'm uncomfortable because, you know, I think people, I hope people take this with a grain of salt. You know, this is the stuff that worked for us, and this is the stuff that worked for me. But, you know, your mileage may definitely vary. And so if anything, I hope that this is sort of stuff to make you think about, not necessarily a prescriptive sort of guidance to, you know, how, well, some of the stuff that I think is pretty prescriptive, like you should have a code of conduct. I don't think there's much question about things like that, but hopefully this is a more of an invitation to a discussion and some thoughts to think about, rather than like, oh, this is exactly the recipe for doing all this sort of stuff. I wanted to start out with sort of my prehistory. As Kara mentioned, I've been involved in maintaining these projects for a really long time. I mean, I started out, I think, as many other people start out, in the sort of late 90s. We needed a load tester, right? I was writing web apps, and we wanted to pound on our web apps before they went live. And I found this tool called JMeter that was pretty small at the time. And in fact, was completely client side. It would just like spin load from your machine, your local machine. And one of the first things that I did was I actually made it so that it could be client server, so that you could actually have multiple server bots running on different machines, so you could actually generate even more load, because we really needed to generate more load than a single machine was capable of spewing out. And in doing that, I sort of got my first orientation to like what it is to add stuff, but then also to have people come along on the other side and be like, hey, like, why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you do this? Or I need this other feature, and start to take that steps down towards maintaining stuff as well. And I think throughout my history with open source, it's sort of one of the simultaneously awesome and also sort of scary things, which is the degree to which, you know, people will come and simply, you know, be excited about what you've built, but also expect you to fix their bugs. And I think balancing those things in any successful community is a really important part of what we do as maintainers. I wanted to give you sort of the rough structure of the talk. This is, you know, print this one out and keep this in case you fall asleep partway through and you snap back in. You're like, oh, okay, here we go. I'm going to talk about the beginning and the formation days, because I think that's where a lot of people are. I'm going to talk about what I call sort of the rocket ship, which is that part where the hockey stick curve sort of you know, kicks in and you go vertical, and that's a very exciting but also kind of scary place to be. And then the after part of that, which is the maturity part, you know, I'm actually not sure PowerPoint sort of did this AI thing to generate these things, and mostly it chose the right icons. I don't know why it associated a bear with maturity, but I rolled with it. And then finally talking about moving on, because I think this is as a founder of a project, and as someone who, or even someone who's just involved in a project at a particular time, it's important to know when it's time to move on. And I think I want to kind of close with thoughts about, like, when do you know when it's time to step back, and how do you make sure that that's something that you should do, and how do you do it in a way that works for both your community and for yourself. So this is the beginning of starting out, and it is a long road, very, very long, but there's hopefully nice things at the end of it. I think the most important thing when you're thinking about your project is to know yourself. And this is sort of like, you know, millennia old advice at this point, I guess, but have clarity about why you're doing this. Have clarity about why you're open source. Have clarity about why you're out on GitHub, right? I mean, some people, putting the project out on GitHub is just a way of, you know, showing to the world what you're working on, right? Like, actually, you don't necessarily care about community, and you don't necessarily care about contributions. It is effectively Instagram for the programmer set. And that's fine. I mean, that's not a negative thing, right? But having that sense about why, you know, are you trying to build a really big community? Are you putting the code out there so that other people can take it and adapt it and remix it, but not necessarily build a community around it? Are you doing it just to kind of put it out there because you feel like it's the right thing to do? I think before you even begin to think about how you scale communities and before you even begin to think about how you scale projects, you should have really crystal clarity about like why. Because if you don't, you won't focus on the right things. And, you know, I think when we looked at Kubernetes, what we really thought we knew what we wanted to be, and what we wanted to be was an ecosystem. I have this really strong belief that open ecosystems win in the end, no matter what. And I think this is played out in technology over and over and over again. And so that's what we wanted to be. We wanted to be an open ecosystem, and that helped clarify what we went on from there out. So when you're starting out, know who you are, and it's okay if it changes too, right? Like it's not something that's required. Like you can't be like, oh, we were this, and suddenly, you know, sometimes you do something and you kick it out there, and you just to put the source code out somewhere, and then it turns into something that is huge. I mean, one of the people I work with at Microsoft is the maintainer of time.js, which I'm sure nobody thought like, hey, it's really useful to have just like the canonical time library for JavaScript, but like it turned into that, and that's okay for it to morph and transition over time. I think that it's really, really important to have a sense for what your goals and metrics are, even at the very beginning. And hint, it's not stars. I'm not. I mean, I love GitHub, but like, I'm not sure stars is the best thing because, you know, it's a drive-by metric, and like there was a lot early on where you're like, ooh, 50,000 stars or whatever, and like we were, you know, competing, and I was like, every day I'd log in and be like, do we have more stars than Golang? And that's just stupid, right? But I think it is important to have metrics. It's important to have an understanding of, you know, how you're measuring success. How do you figure out if you're moving towards success? And I think in these early days, your most important metrics have to do with issues, PRs, and general responsiveness to interacting with your community, right? Because at the end of the day, if at least for us, if you're trying to build a community, you know, issues are a great sign that people are using your stuff, right? Like, I mean, I hate to break it to you, but the very first thing that you are going to build, it's going to be broken a lot, and it's going to not work for a lot of people. And so if you launch something new and there are 0 issues in your issues queue, it's a pretty good sign that nobody's using your stuff, right? And so the issue queue is a great place to understand if your stuff is being used. It's also a good place to understand like if you have really horrible quality problems, and that's obviously something that you need to address. And then I would say that the PR queue is the opposite, which is it's sort of showing interest, right? If issues show usage, the PR queue is the thing that shows you like, do people actually care enough to contribute? And I think that these two things taken together give you a strong sense for the health of your project, especially in the early days. Because the honest to God truth of the matter is that like, this is the world that you're living in, right? You know, you have in these early days when you're sort of, I mean, and I don't think a lot of people remember this, but like when Kubernetes launched, there was probably 10 or 15 other container orchestrators out there on GitHub or in other places in the open source world, right? There's a myriad of choices. I think people at this point think, oh, well, of course, people would choose this because it's in the clouds and it's all this sort of stuff. But like at the time, there were a ton of different choices that people could go with, both to use and to contribute to, right? And like this is the, you know, you have 2 hours. I always told everybody, you have 2 hours. You've got 2 hours to help somebody becomes more successful. And after 2 hours, they're gone and they're done with your project and they're never coming back, right? And I think that it's incredibly important in these early stages when you think about attracting people to the project. It's incredibly important that you focus on that 2 hour. I mean, maybe 2 hours is a little too prescriptive, but like you focus on that 2 hour experience. That means really good docs. That means really good, you know, responsiveness on the issues queues. I think that this leads so that this need to sort of make sure that the people who you attract, you retain, leads to a bunch of different approaches. One of the most important things is to look alive. Right, so we created an IRC channel early in the days of Kubernetes. I don't know if people remember what IRC is, but it's like Slack without emojis. Well, the emojis were sort of there. You know, we created this IRC channel, and it was kind of empty. It was kind of quiet, and there's crickets. And so one of the things I did early on is I I started piping all of our continuous integration test results into this Slack, or into this IRC channel. I did this mostly just so that there was something there, so that if somebody logged into this IRC channel, they wouldn't just sort of like look around, hear the crickets, and leave. You know, at least there's this bot like spitting, you know, test result failures or test result passes into the channel, and there's something for people to see. There's a little bit of action. Maybe they'll stick around. Maybe we'll get lucky and there'll be 2 people who come and they might talk to each other. You know, and eventually over time we turned it off, right? Because there was enough organic activity in the channel that we didn't need this sort of pseudo-organic activity in the channel to look alive. But it really is important. And I mean, I do the same thing with GitHub, right? Like I'll go to a project and I'll look, and if you haven't have a change in the last week or the last couple of weeks, I figure your project is dead, right? And so I think in these early days, one of the most important things you can think about is looking alive. I think in addition to looking alive, so that kind of gets people from bouncing off. You have to be welcoming. I think people underestimate how important this is, and also simultaneously how hard this is. You know, and being welcoming is more than just, you know, not being unwelcoming. Being welcoming is actually going over and above to help people feel welcome. I mean, I think even in the Kubernetes client libraries today, we get people who are clearly stepping to Kubernetes for the first time, who really don't have a ton of understanding of how the thing works. And they ask a question that is something they probably should have read in the documentation, and it isn't really related to the client libraries. But I help them anyway, because I mean, and I have to admit that sometimes, like if I'm in a worse mood, I help them less than if I'm in a good mood. But we help them anyway, because it's really, really important that that person who's taken the time to get involved in your thing, who's put themselves out there by filing an issue or whatever it is, feels invited into your community. And I cannot overemphasize that this is hard for people to do correctly. It takes a ton of energy. It takes a ton of like mindfulness to be able to step back from the immediate, like, why are you asking me the stupid question for the 1,000th time in a row, to invite that person in, because as a maintainer, it may be the 1,000th time you've heard this question, but for that person, it's the very first time they've interacted with your project. And you have to be respectful of what it took to get them to that point. It's hugely important in the early days. I think that the next thing that is really important that you'd be thinking about is being quick, right? And I think that this is the responsiveness. This is sort of the flip side of being welcoming. So it's really great to be welcoming, let people in and be friendly to them, and that sort of thing. But if you're not responsive, they're going to walk away anyway, right? And so one of the things that we did very early on was actually assign somebody a permanent on-call position. When it wasn't permanent, it was a rotation, but we created an on-call rotation that was dedicated to GitHub issues, IRC, and Stack Overflow. And the reason for this was just to make sure that our response rate was fast, right? So that if somebody had a question, they immediately had their question answered. If somebody ran into a problem, they immediately had somebody asking questions about understanding more about what the problem was. And the reason for this is, like, again, it's all about engagement, right? You have that person coming in and they are starting to be engaged with your product. Well, if you take 3 days to get back to them, they've had a chance to wander off. And in wandering off, they may have found some other project that looks interesting, or they may have gotten involved in something else, right? And so, like, if you want to be gathering people into a community and building a community in those early stages, you have to sort of keep them on the hook. And if this sounds sort of like, marketing, it is, honestly, right? Like, especially, I want to reemphasize, especially in those early stages, unless you're like amazingly unique, and the truth is that most projects are not amazingly unique, you have a ton of competition. And if you want your project to be successful, you have to think of it as a marketing exercise. I mean, obviously there's a lot other stuff too, but that's part of it. And so I think these 3 things combined in the early days are the things that actually helped us sort of get up over the hump, right? And that's, get up to that place where the hockey stick starts to accelerate up. And that brings us to the next part, which is the rocket ship phase. And this was, I mean, I would say this is one of the more unique parts of my life. I don't know that I'll ever replicate it again. But that phase where we went from 4, 5, 6 people to suddenly thousands of people, it was just a truly unique experience, and one for which there's not a lot of guideposts. And so it's really important. I think hopefully one of the takeaways from this talk will be, maybe if you hit one of these hockey sticks, you'll understand what to do. I think one of the most important things is transitioning from knowing your project to knowing your user. Who are the people who are actually starting? Like, if thousands of people are showing up, who are the people who are actually showing up to do it? This helps you shape what you need to do in order to sustain the hockey stick, right? So it's no longer, you now know who you are. You no longer need to attract people. They're coming. Now you need to understand who those people are and how you can best address them. And in this context, you need to, the goals and metrics that you should be thinking about effectively are those associated with, release metrics, for example. Like, you need to be making sure there's weekly releases. You need to be making sure that there's a good roadmap. You need to be, you're getting into a phase where people are betting significant chunks of their businesses on your thing. And you need to be providing the metrics for them so that they can feel confident and feel comfortable. But there's also a bunch of other things that you need to be thinking about, which is sort of more about like community health. And this is more difficult to measure, but I think that this is, in that hockey stick, this is the most dangerous thing that happens, right? And so I think one of the biggest things that happens when the project hockey sticks is suddenly there's a ton of different people with competing interests. When you're like 4 people doing your thing, like, you're all kind of pulling in the same direction. But if you're in thousands of people, so if you've gone from tens to hundreds to thousands, even at hundreds, you suddenly got a bunch of competing interactions. And in professional open source, in open source where people are, building software as part of a company, you also have people's career considerations. Like, I want to build that not just because it's cool, but actually because I think I could get promoted. And as a maintainer and as someone who's responsible for a big project, making sure that all those different people are, roughly speaking, headed in the same direction becomes a huge challenge. And one where there can be the potential for a ton of conflict. It's emotionally draining. It's something that I think is really an important part of the rocket ship phase. I think the next thing that's really important is designing for scale, right? So one of the things that we did early on is we really built a very decoupled architecture. And the reason for this decoupling is partially because it helps with reliability, but also it actually helps with scalability. So we could actually create someone who's going to say, hey, you're the kubelet team. Hey, you're the API server team. Hey, you're going to focus on RBAC and security, right? And that decoupling allowed for, instead of trying to herd all 10,000 cats, allows you to group the cats into smaller groups of 10 or 15, much easier to herd the cats in a group of 10 or 15. And more importantly, you can designate it to somebody and you can say, hey, people, those are your cats and you should be responsible for them. And so I think it's really, really important. In the early days, it doesn't necessarily matter as much, but when you start to hit that hockey stick, you better be in a place where you've designed for scale. I think the next thing that becomes really interesting is that you have to formalize everything, right? Because it used to be, and you're in a small project, and this, the KEPs are a great example of this, the Kubernetes enhancement proposals. When Kubernetes enhancement proposals first came around, I was just so vehemently opposed. I was like, this is terrible. This is bureaucratic. This is everything that I hate about large scale software development. And what I realized is that for me, as someone who'd been involved in this project since its beginning, it was true. It was bureaucratic and it felt incredibly slow. But for people who were new to the project, these things were a godsend because it gave them a formalism that could help them understand how to contribute. It gave them a process by which they could understand how decisions had been made in the past, right? And so what you have to realize is in that first order of magnitude shift from the small project to the hockey stick project, the context that you had as a maintainer and as a person who originated a project is not the context that people are going to bring to it who are coming to this thing new. And while the formality at the early days may have felt like baggage, the formality in the second stage actually becomes an essential part of continuing the growth. Because if you don't continue to bring new people in, you will stagnate. And I think that this also leads to the most important part of the learnings. And this is one of those places where I think we didn't realize this until later. And it was really important for us to realize, like, at a certain scale, the problems of your project are humanity's problems. you're going to have people who are jerks. You're going to have people who want to cheat the system. You're going to have people who just can't get along with anybody else, right? And the sooner you can recognize the fact that like you're suddenly at a large enough scale that you can't just sort of rely on people being nice to each other, the better off you will be. And that leads to governance, right? And I want to highlight this because I think this is the place where we both had the least places to look for, we started doing governance too late in the Kubernetes project, right? And we got extremely lucky that the project didn't explode before we had governance in place. We should have started a year earlier. And so I think it's very bureaucratic for people to think in an early stage of a product, like, hey, we need to identify, how do we make decisions? How do we elevate people to leadership roles? How do we, understand where our community is at? This is an essential component of scaling even a medium-sized project for sustainable success. And much like, I think a lot of hay has been made around code of conduct, which is a valuable part of governance. But honestly, like, I think we need to do more in the maintainer community to talk about, like, not just how and the importance of governance, but actually give people examples, right? Like, there's 10 different open source licenses that you can choose from. So if you invent your own open source license, you're either a megalomaniac or you're just, crazy, right? But there's no governance. Like, what's the equivalent of the Apache 2 license in governance? I mean, Apache has governance, but like, it's not like it's something you can easily import into your project. Well, if you join the Apache Foundation, maybe you get it by force. But I think this is an area where we really, as a maintainer community, need to do a ton more work, because basically what we did, the governance committee that came together to form the governance docs, is we looked at a bunch of other places that had done similar things, and we thought about what they maybe messed up and how we could possibly forestall their mistakes, and then we talked through it for like a long time. And if we had had better rubrics to start from, I think we would have been in a better place. And if somebody had sat us down much earlier on and said, hey, you're going to need to do this now, not in a year when it's a almost crisis, but now, we would have been in such a better place. All right, I'm actually rapidly running through my time, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the maturing phases of the project. And I think this is equally important. Kubernetes is sort of going through this today. It's really important in this context to know what you're not. Right? Where you stop. There's a real appetite when you get a successful project going to be like, oh my gosh, we're going to take over the world and we're going to do all the things. Don't. Right? Know where you stop. Know where there should be new projects on top of you. And don't try and take over the world, or you will just ultimately become so top heavy that you'll fail. In this world, I think the metrics have to do with much more to do with like the metrics of success: reliability, consistency, how many API breaks did you have? Hopefully your issue queue actually is now slowing down. Your PR queue should absolutely be slowing down. And in general, you should be slowing down, right? As well as, working on the details, right? Where is the places you made the bad decisions? Let's go back and fix this. You're seeing this in some of the work on things like Ingress v2. And I think also, you need to make room, right? So I think this is the corollary of knowing what you're not. One of the greatest things that we did in the Kubernetes project is make it extensible, so that many of the things that are now part of what people think of in the Kubernetes ecosystem are not actually projects in the Kubernetes repository. They're not even necessarily projects in the Kubernetes organization. And that ability to make room and enable other projects to form around you and make other projects form on top of you, and actually, in some sense, fade to the background, is another key part of what it means to be successful. And I want to conclude with my own personal thoughts about sort of moving on, because if you skip ahead to my commit history on Kubernetes, this is what it looks like, right? I got one commit in 2021, but I contributed a ton of code. I'm still number 6 on the leaderboard, having like effectively stopped contributing long ago. And I think this is important, because it turns out actually that I'm not sort of unique in this pattern. And if we look at a couple of the other top contributors, the same pattern holds, perhaps with a few more contributions. And actually, if you look at the project as a whole, you'll see that the contributions are declining as well. And this is actually correct. right? Like this is a natural byproduct of the way projects go. And that's really, really important as someone who gets deeply involved in these things to build a project so that you can step away, other people can step up. And also, frankly, so that you know when to go. And I think an important part of knowing when to go is finding a home. And I think one of the things that's been amazing for me is being able to step into the space. I own the Kubernetes client libraries for Java, JavaScript, C#, and a lot of the generation code as well, C also. And it's been really nice to have stepped from this giant project into kind of this little small backwater, but essential, right? I mean, if you want to talk to Kubernetes from Java, you're going to come use this library that we wrote. It's an essential part. It's enabled me to sort of continue to scratch the itch around being a maintainer, around working in an open source community, supporting a community, but at a much smaller scale that fits well within the broader confines of my current, occupation, running a 600-person organization. And so I think as we think about our own life cycle within these projects, it's incredibly valuable to find a place where you can get what you need from the project while also not standing in the way of perhaps a project that has outgrown you. And with that, I'm going to conclude. I want to be respectful of time. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to head over to GatherTown, although it's super cool. I've done it in other places, and it's super cool. I definitely recommend it. But I'm always up on Twitter if people want to hit me up there. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come and chat with you today. Thanks.